Então, nós vamos iniciando imediatamente esse último momento de conferência. Porém, antes de iniciarmos, nós só queremos comunicar. Nós queremos comunicar que a fala que foi comentada antes pelo professor Agir, que é a respeito do discurso do Giorgio Agamben na Catedral de Notre Dame, está disponível na página do IHU. Quem tiver interesse pode procurar por esse título.
So those of you who are interested in this article, in this talk by Giorgio Agamben, will find it on the site of our institute. So, let's move then to the final conference of our colloquium. It's a great pleasure to welcome again here Professor Colby Dickinson. I'm not going to introduce him again today. We are the same group here. The conference today has the title Glória as a Central Arcane of Power and the Ties Between Economia, Government, and Management. We have about 1 hour and 15 minutes or a little longer for the conference itself. Then we have some time for a discussion. We have to finish here shortly before 1 o'clock because our speaker must leave, catch a flight. But anyway, we'll have enough time for a good discussion after his talk. So I give the floor right away to you, Professor Dickinson. Obrigado.
So I will be continuing on some of the themes I was discussing yesterday, but focusing a little more not only on the concept of glory in Agamben's work, but also this Pauline task, the messianic task of deactivating or rendering inoperative the structures that be, the identities that be. And I begin with a quote from the French writer Michel Henry. Economic work is precisely the unreal representation of real and invisible work, end quote. Karl Marx's genius had lain in his ability to describe the creation of political economic forms that appeared to resolve the problem of exchange value. In essence, there is no measure of true equivalence for the labors that people engage in, only an inefficient appearance and abstraction of such labor, as Michel Henry described it in the context of Marx's work. Somewhat like Jean-Yves Lacoste, as we will see in a moment, Henry conceives of a form of Christianity, however, absolute life is what he calls it in his parlance, that searches for a genuine equivalence beyond economic forms, one that places the neighbor on a precisely equal terrain to the self, thereby producing the truth, if we can call it a truth, the truth that lies underneath all forms of economic exchange, but which can never really be represented by a given economy of symbols or representations or financial transaction or anything along these lines. This is the impulse that undergirds Henry's return to religion, as some have put it, but I think which covers many authors we look at in contemporary continental philosophy. And it is this impulse which provides a determinate theological focus to Henry's phenomenological work. As we might suggest that St. Paul too had immediately grasped, the abstracted identities that undergird economic relations, slave, master, Jew, Greek, male, female, and so forth, are somehow undone by Christian claims to move beyond the firm hold of economic forms, no matter whether these economies are symbolic, financial, religious, literary, political, social, and cultural, and so forth. This is the substantive claim that Henri wishes to unleash with philosophical force upon the political and economic forces of our world that have, you could say, for far too long, neglected to account for an alternative perspective on life itself. And here, given in an explicitly theological, though in an undetermined and perhaps unrepresentable sense. This is Henri's concern with absolute life, which he draws out of the theological tradition, and I think bears a very strong resemblance to Agamben's discussion of the form of life. So building somewhat in the same vein as Henri, Jean-Yves Lacoste has referred to our experience of being at home in the world as an oikology. So he's coining a phrase, but it's an oikonomia merged with a logos. It's an oikology, he calls it. An intimate interconnection between oikonomia and language that defines the human experience of being in the world, and in a Heideggerian context. This suggestive phrase is not far off from Agamben's analysis of the sacrament of language, as it is discernible within the economy that governs human affairs and replicates subjects as persons or as human beings. For Lacoste in particular, the only possible resistance against such an oikology is one locatable in what he calls the liturgical reduction of our being at home in the world. An explicitly theological procedure that, as we will soon see, I think paralleled in Agamben's work, is perhaps the best possible place from which to view the messianic suspension of suspension itself, a sort of negative dialectics that mirrors, I would argue, the phenomenological reduction, which is itself a reduction of an already socially produced reduction of the fullness of human life, lived beyond its inscription into a matrix of identifications and definitions, the very substance, then, of what we consider to be an irrational foundational order. What each of these three authors represents, Henri, Lacoste, Agamben, and so why I take them up together in a sort of strange unison, is an account of a particular theological interpretation that has not been made explicitly manifest within the majority of historical theological accounts of Christianity's relation to economic forms. Indeed, you could say Christianity's implicit indebtedness to mythological forms of exclusionary inclusion have resulted in the perpetual rearticulation and justification of God's, humanity's, and the church's employment of sovereign power in very real and worldly terms. The question that lingers further here, and will presumably linger throughout the analysis of Agamben's work in general, is to what degree such a messianic suspension of governing institutional norms or identities could ever become a history in and of itself, or whether, rather, in a much more, what I would say, a Derridian sense, following Jacques Derrida, or whether the weak force of the messianic will be that which haunts every institution or normative structure without ever positing a history for itself. For to declare itself the majority is to dominate over another and to cease the radically deconstructive act that I believe Agamben calls messianic. Now, without immediately resolving this question, however, we are still able to discern the difficulty of attempting to resolve these questions through some of the theological examples that Agamben takes up and which hinge upon theological efforts to avoid the problem altogether by positing the sovereignty of God as the ultimate solution, or we could say perhaps the ultimate denial of a political reality, depending on one's perspective. Such an investigation, from Agamben's point of view, includes a critique of the attempted transfer of sheer power and domination that glory, this concept of glory, attempts to mask and to maintain in the sphere of the aesthetic through the concept of the beautiful, what Agamben senses to truly be at work in the theological aesthetics focused on glory in the work of Hans Urs von Balthasar and Karl Barth. And I mentioned them yesterday, but I'm going to look at the Agamben's take on these two theologians a little more in depth. To give just a glimpse of this connection between glory and beauty as evident and lingering justifications for sovereign power, whether vested in God or in humanity, we might look, for example, to von Balthasar's theological aesthetics as taken up in his The Glory of the Lord project, a movement that is made parallel to Barth's attempts to ground God's sovereignty in his distance from any worldly affairs, and thus to offer a permanent critique of all political and religious forms. The problem with such a maneuver, however, to gain this distance to permanently critique all worldly activity, the problem with this is that the effort to identify God with glory and beauty and to ignore, in some sense, the political elements latent within such a vision, as Agamben illustrates in the context of these theological works, is to run a more significant risk of repeating the worst aspects of political glory and its potentially authoritarian liturgical operations. Quote, the attempt to exclude the very possibility of a Christian political theology so as to found in glory the only legitimate political dimension of Christianity comes dangerously close to the totalitarian liturgy, end quote. It is perhaps no surprise that Barth's theology in particular, which serves as a source of inspiration for von Balthasar's in many respects, is inherently Christocentric, dependent upon the precise binary nature that, as a contemporary of Barth's, Ernst Kantorowicz, had signaled, is what sustains a certain outworking of political theology. This was the binity or the two that I spoke about yesterday. So Barth's Christocentric approach, Agamben thinks, relapses into a two-ness rather than taking an authentic track toward a more, let's say, a Trinitarian logic or a logic that deconstructs the inherent bipolar machinery of Western political theology. Much of Western theology has been concerned over the years with covering up its particular emphasis upon Christ and Christological thinking, a form of Christomonism, which has been utilized to justify and legitimate Western imperial positions. This was Kantorowicz's point. In critique of such structures, we witness Agamben's claims regarding how divine Trinitarian economy was actually turned into a machine that ultimately created the Western subject, as well as Esposito's notion of the two and its relation to the Trinity or Binity as he calls it. For Esposito, who follows Kantorowicz's reading of the King's two bodies on this, the Binity, as an extreme emphasis placed on the bond between the Father and the Son, in order to combat the historical heresy of Arianism, was never really eradicated from the sphere of politics and has come in many ways to define Western theological articulations of the Trinity as well. The reciprocal relations of the Father and the Son in this way refuse to be disrupted by the entrance of a third term, the Holy Spirit, in order to deconstruct their attempt to dualistically posit themselves as sovereign. There is certainly another theological possibility of reading the Trinity as a potential undoing of the binity that dominates Western political theology, but this is something that remains relatively unexplored in most political theological contexts. I think as an aside here, but a profound illustration of this, we could think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Bonhoeffer's early Barthian influence the way he received Karl Barth's work, which allowed him to say in his book on the cost of discipleship that Christians travel throughout the world as if they are in a train car, sealed. This was his image, unaffected by the external world, at an absolute distance from its activity, and conceivably then its politics. But of course, the more Bonhoeffer experienced of the corrupt political forms of the world, the more he began to realize perhaps that's not how Christians function in the world. And that Barthian distance began to close. And then you see Bonhoeffer's writing begin to fragment in a way. It's a very interesting example of the breakdown, I would say, of this Barthian way of thinking. The linkage that von Balthasar posits between glory and sovereignty is, as such, the inevitable conclusion drawn from Barth's restoration of God's sovereignty established through Christ's dual nature. It is in this sense that Agamben can declare that, quote, glory is precisely the place at which this bilateral or biunivocal character of the relation between theology and politics clearly emerges into the light, end quote. And so, presumably, it is also the reason that it becomes the focal point for the subsequent Barthian theology of von Balthasar. The human being is thereby caught up in the glory offered to God through praise of God's glory, the reciprocal relationship of glory that signals the whole-scale incorporation of sovereign power within a theological paradigm. Rather than depart from the fundamental gestures of sovereign power in the human political sphere, such theologies seem to do little more than legitimate such powers in ecclesial terms. The modern theological positions that Agamben's critique of this, he calls biunivocal or bilateral character, or the binity or two-ness of sovereign power, so what this position mirrors is therefore not that of von Balthasar or Barth, to be sure, but rather those of feminist, queer, and other contextual theologians who have mounted a vast critique of the oppressive, we say heteronormative or strictly binary forms of gender and sexuality, for example, that are utilized to oppress particular minority persons or groups. These are often theologies, it should be equally noted, that are frequently denounced as apparently antinomian, a charge that resonates with Agamben's philosophy as well. It should come as no surprise, then, that the messianic visions of a trinity beyond the binity, of a trinity that cannot be reinscribed back into a binity, but which rather ceaselessly deconstructs it, are favored by queer theologians in particular for its radical subversive possibility. And I wrote this before yesterday when a question was asked about Marcella Althaus-Reid. I had already focused on this, but Marcella Althaus-Reid often favorably cited Agamben's work as a central philosophical attempt to move past the binary systems of thought that have guided Western politics from its inception. The meditation that Agamben's critique opens up to us is therefore much wider than might at first glance be expected in The Kingdom and the Glory, which is mainly restricted to its genealogical methods and frequently refrains from drawing connections to the larger oeuvre of Agamben's writings. What he charts then in particular dovetails nicely with his larger considerations of numerous theological topics that all center around the issue of a suspension of the normative order and everyday activity that seems to accompany not only reflections on the Sabbath in the Judaic and Christian traditions, but also speculation on what the heavenly afterlife might resemble in its unending praise and glory of God, other than what ostensibly appears to be, and this is how I think a lot of us think of a heaven where you sing praises to God unendingly for infinity, as a acute, even ironically torturous state of infinite boredom. This is I remember my son asking, what do you do in heaven? And I said, well, traditionally people say it's unending praise of God. And he says, this is like going to church forever. That's hell. Huh? I think Agamben would agree. Huh? In this sense, theological discussions on the afterlife and an eternity of glorification of God's glory are really little more than a political theological laboratory, as Roberto Esposito has phrased it, for humanity's configuration of itself in relation to sovereign and governmental power. Hence the focus on the angelology as a bureaucracy, but also on the notion of God, and our worship and giving glory to God unendingly as political forms of liturgy. In this configuration, not even the angels are safe from our own political conclusions. Quote, "It is now comprehensible why the perfect cipher of Christian citizenship is constituted by the song of praise, and the pleromatic figures of the political is bestowed upon the angels who have become inoperative. The doctrine of glory as the final end of man and as the figure of the divine that outlives the government of the world is the answer that theologians give to the problem of the end of economy. The angelic ministries survive the universal judgment only as a hymnological hierarchy, as contemplation and praise of the glory of the divine. With every providential operation exhausted, and with all administration of salvation coming to an end, only song remains. Liturgy survives only as doxology." End quote. I think it's either this or the image. There's a play which was made into a film, Angels in America. I don't know if you've seen this or heard of this. I think that's also a very fitting possibility. You go up into heaven, and it's angels with stacks of paperwork. And the person who goes to heaven says, "Where's God?" And the angels say, "We don't know. God's been gone for a very long time. We're just doing the paperwork and filing things, and that's heaven." Huh? Either that or songs for eternity. Or maybe that's the same thing. Huh? The only thing that such theological conjectures on the angelic hierarchies and eternal liturgies reveal is the empty center that humanity ceaselessly tries to conceal. That such activities only serve the purpose of sustaining a very worldly legitimation of reciprocal glory, what tries to suture together the kingdom and the government as a single political theological mechanism. In such images, God simply sits on the throne in heaven, ostensibly doing nothing, or the throne is empty, so as to embody the glory of the sovereign, leaving unanswered the eternal torment of having to take part in endless liturgies of power and glorification, as well as the question of what God was occupied with before the creation of the world. God, as we are led to understand things, is really concealing, through reference to being and act, an abyss of potentiality and actuality. An abyss of potentiality and inoperativity that cannot be ignored but must be ceaselessly covered over. It's the angelic bureaucrats being busy to ignore the fact that there is no God who is there. It's a Kafka novel displaced into heaven. In response to the inoperative figure of the divine that appears to do nothing prior to the creation of this world, Agamben posits how, quote, "Glory is what must cover with its splendor the unaccountable figure of divine inoperativity," end quote. As perhaps the ultimate model of what theologians contemplate when they contemplate the suspension of normal economic relations in the Sabbath, or the suspension of normal work order in lieu of celebration and feasting. Giving a face to the operation of inoperativity that Agamben seeks to formulate, the Sabbath, or the general feast day even, grants us a look into the messianic deactivation that would become an alternative to the economic order that governs our world and its many representations. Or we could say, and this is what I think is very complex than Agamben's thought. He sometimes presents it early in his work as if it is an alternative, and then he seems to present it later as if it is simply a moment within every institutional form. And it's not always so clear. And this is why he runs the risk of being charged as antinomian, because he appears to point or gesture toward a realm where law does not exist. And then more recently, he tries to gesture toward a force working within every law to undo it, but that is simultaneously present to it. And I think that's why I call him Derridian in a certain sense, because that was Derrida's project of deconstruction, the weak messianic force of Benjamin. I think this is also why Agamben and Derrida have a very long feud between them. They seem to be always attacking each other or criticizing each other, even though their work is really close together, in some ways almost unmistakably joined. But okay, that's another conversation. As Agamben tries to make clear, quote, "The feast day is not defined by what is not done in it, but instead by the fact that what is done, which in itself is not unlike what is accomplished every day, becomes undone, rendered inoperative, liberated and suspended from its economy, from the reasons and aims that define it during the weekdays, and not doing in this sense is only an extreme case of this suspension," end quote. The characteristic feature of the Sabbath suspension, then, is its ability to deactivate an already operative economy, and to declare such a suspension of economic and rational order as the messianic task par excellence. What such figures of eternal contemplation and praise, alongside a deity who appears to have a degree of inoperativity that must be concealed, what these call to mind is the very real suspension of entirely human norms and rules, orders and principalities, that in turn give rise to new forms of thought. The philosophical procedure that Agamben discerns latent within these many theological genealogies of figures of inoperativity, but which is all too often suppressed so that sovereign power might be somewhere maintained. Indeed, it is even possible to co-opt the Sabbath itself, not as an act of deactivation, which it should be, he says, an act of deactivation or decreation or the destituent potential. These are all synonyms that he uses as he labels them. It is possible, he says, to also take the Sabbath and co-opt it for sovereign power as potentially a site of, and this I put in parentheses, as a site of false sacrality, which thereby extracts the radical messianic force from it and domesticates it for institutional power. So the Sabbath becomes a very unique case where it should be a moment of messianic suspension, but it can be restored to institutional form to sustain some sense of, let's say, ecclesial power. Quote, "This does not mean that the human activities that the feast has suspended and rendered inoperative are necessarily separated and transported into a more elevated and solemn sphere. It is possible, in fact, that this separation of the feast into the sacred sphere, which certainly came about at a certain point, was the work of the church and the clergy," end quote. So this is not a kind word for the church and the clergy. This is the mythological church, we could say, something like that. And its supposed minions, its clergy, who serve an exclusionary inclusive mechanism, the Western anthropological machinery, by stamping each subject with a particular theological signature. Yeah, so they bring the Sabbath, which should be a moment of suspension, back into the operations of the church, and thereby they sacralize, they make sacred the Sabbath. Yeah? But it's a false form of sacrality, Agamben is intimating. It's precisely such forces as well who fight against the apparent growth of the secular sphere and defend the inscription of a false form of sacrality that would merely replicate the order and rationality that Agamben finds no real use for. His repeated calls for an act of profanation beyond the sacred-secular dichotomy run fairly directly across these lines. And this is what enables him to critique, let's say, sacred notions of the Sabbath or sacred feast days that miss the point of what a genuine suspension is about. Quote, "We should perhaps try to invert the familiar chronology according to which religious phenomena are placed at the origin only to be secularized later on." And this was, of course, Carl Schmitt's basic understanding of political theology, that all political concepts in the modern period are basically secularized theological ones. Agamben is resisting this chronology, he calls it. First it was sacred, then it became secular. He says we should resist this and instead hypothesize that what comes first is the moment in which human activities are simply neutralized and rendered inoperative during the feast. That's the act of profanation. You don't restore it to its sacredness. You don't remove the sacredness to make it purely secular. You suspend it into a state of almost neutrality, where it loses its sense of identity and meaning. That's the act of profanation. He goes on to say, what we call religion, a term that in its current meaning is missing from ancient culture, intervenes at that moment by capturing the feast in a separate sphere. That's that moment of taking something that's supposed to suspend all identities and representations and economies and brings it back into the sacred sphere. What you have here is an endless political battle between the sacred and the secular. We sometimes call these culture wars, right? Should we have Christmas or should we just say happy holidays? This is a big American one. We're going to either be sacred, which is always a veiled, thinly veiled legitimation of some sort of sovereign Christian vision. Evangelicals in America love this. Or it's going to be totally secular. It's a denunciation of the sacred, but effectively it suppresses the exact same desire and tries to legitimate a sovereign power on the other end. Agamben wants neither option. And he thinks he's found the most authentic way to interpret what Christ was doing when Christ, let's say, tore the temple curtain in half and rendered the Holy of Holies profane. This is not a new thing. This is an ancient act, but it's one we still don't understand. It's these religious gestures of trying to re-sacralize something that must be resisted as they seek to isolate and identify or create the religious subject. What we are left with then, in Agamben's critique of such falsely religious acts of sacralization, is the sense that a new use of the human body is possible beyond its theological signature, one that is strangely identifiable in the modern world. And I take up this notion of the body as a prime example of exactly how Agamben intends to resist the theological signature that's placed upon the subject. He tries to revert to something like the human body beyond its theological imprimatur, its theological signature. And he thinks that by pointing to this, he can begin to discuss or illustrate what it might look like to see the profanation of the human subject. It would be a body without the theological signature placed upon it. The first example that Agamben gives of such a possible new use of the body is in the coming community, where the emergent capitalist processes of reification or objectification are also strangely liberating, he says, in that they at least remove the theological signature that had been placed upon the body. As such, and this is the example he takes up, the female body, as the outstanding example of cultural objectification, we talk about the objectification of women, etc., is somehow also freed in the modern period from its enslavement to the theological signatures that have been placed upon it. For example, virginity, or of being a mother who reproduces. So this takes place, this liberation takes place from those signatures at the same time that the female body is, we would say, sexually objectified. Yeah? Removed from the ideals of virginity and of motherhood, which are brought to it by a certain Christian theological Western reading of the female and her body. But it's also sexually objectified at the same time. Oh, it's a very interesting example. He doesn't say much more about it in this context, but he hints that the processes of reification or objectification somehow liberate the body at the same time as they perhaps repress it or dominate it in another sense. So this is an ambiguous sense of the body's new use. The second example, which may help us clarify the trajectory of his thinking on the body, is made available through the rise of pornographic films and the bodies engaged therein that introduce, again, a new use for the body beyond its theological signature. He takes this up in a couple contexts. This is a new use that in fact parallels the glorious resurrected body that theologians have long contemplated as existing beyond the register of everyday bodily functions. He takes this up in his collection of essays called Nudities. Here, the lack of lived bodily economics within the glorious body could only mirror the body of the porn star, as neither the glorious body nor the porn star are forced to engage in the basic necessities of everyday life that the body must otherwise attend to. So, using the bathroom, eating food, these things don't happen to glorious bodies, and they don't happen to pornographic bodies, unless it's some perverse other thing. But yeah, they're not actually taking part in the economies of everyday life. In both examples, we witness, again, like the first example, a new possible use for the body beyond the theological signatures, while also sensing certain limitations that keep us at a remove from truly rendering our representations of the body inoperative. So we're sort of, I would say these first two examples leave us sort of mesmerized, or we're very intrigued by them, even though we're a bit repulsed by them at the same time. I really wonder about this, if this is why Christians have been so opposed to pornography. Putting aside the issue of the exploitation of persons and of women, etc., which is a very real issue, simply the image itself is very disturbing. And I wonder why and to what degree it is disturbing. Especially in America, we have a big puritanical mindset. So anything that smacks of too much bodily nudity is, shield your eyes, look away. But why? And I wonder to what degree the affront or the challenge of the pornographic image or of nudity that is removed from an everyday context presents us with the challenge of having to think a new use of the body beyond its theological signature. I think, at least in part, pornography is so disturbing to Christians, as the Western group that attacks it the most. It's so disturbing because precisely, and Agamben's point is made, it attacks the normal theological signature that is given to our use of the body. It seems to speak of something beyond that use, and therefore is disturbing in a sense. But also, it's secretly what we want. It's the glorious body that we all hope to achieve someday, when everything that is imperfect about our bodies is made perfect. And I think this is the general characteristic of pornography. It's a bunch of perfect bodies, doing acts we wish we too could do, but we don't know how to say that so we oppose it. It's a real complex game, I think, to understand for Christians what is at stake in the pornographic image. But okay. The third example, which I think goes beyond these first two and tries to develop something more positive, is also something Agamben is struggling to articulate. The third example arises in the final volume of the Homo Sacer series, The Use of Bodies, where the task of contemplation provides another byway from which to view the operation of deactivation with regard to the theological signature placed upon the human body, and so to its possible liberation. Referencing Plotinus, Agamben seeks to expand upon the former's notion of life as an immediate form of contemplation, and is thereby able to conceive of contemplation as a paradigm for use instead of its obverse partner, possession. We are able to access something like a form of life through the both theological and philosophical act of contemplation, because it is this act in particular that restores us to our own most potentiality. Quote, like use, contemplation does not have a subject, because in it the contemplator is completely lost and dissolved. Like use, contemplation does not have an object, because in the work it contemplates only its own potential. Life, which contemplates in the work its own potential of acting or making, is rendered inoperative in all its works and lives only in use of itself, lives only its livability. End quote. I think it is this livability that Agamben is particularly attentive to, because this seems to offer us an opportunity to glimpse life beyond its inscription in the anthropological machinery of Western humanity, beyond then its theological signature. Bearing testimony to the possible deactivation of the human subject, contemplation promises the inoperativity of the human being and an access to whatever being, as he calls it, to whatever being appears in its place. The centrality of contemplation and its inoperativity, here taken as synonymous terms, in fact, is what Agamben links explicitly to form of life with the hyphens. The properly human life, he calls it, that, quote, is the one that by rendering inoperative the specific works and functions of the living being causes them to idle, so to speak, and in this way opens them into possibility. Contemplation and inoperativity are in this sense the metaphysical operators of anthropogenesis, which in liberating living human beings from every biological and social destiny, that's their theological signature, and every predetermined task, render them available for that particular absence of work that we are accustomed to calling politics and art, end quote. Agamben's remarks on contemplation as another form of inoperativity, specifically in relation to a new use of the body beyond its historical theological signatures, and so the glory that has frequently obscured the very real bodies underneath the objectifying veil. This is what the glorious body signified. This bears, in fact, a remarkable overlap with those critical political theorists who would advocate for not taking action in the face of what appears to be a looming need for political action or decision. So I think this idea of contemplation is more than just a discussion of inoperativity for the body. It's a political concept. And we see this in a number of political theorists, even contemporary ones, who advocate for a stepping back from the need for political praxis, for acting, and contemplate a state of contemplation. They want to act, they don't want to act, they want to think rather than act. So let me explain this a little more. These are positions staked in opposition to the Schmittian necessity for a decision. We see this call to think in the work, we could say, of both Slavoj Žižek, but also in Theodor Adorno, for example, who both resist the Schmittian call to decisive political action as yet another reinscription into the political and anthropological machinery that presents sovereign decisionism as a necessity and is thus incapable of thinking a more authentic revolutionary potential for transformation. Adorno, who was significantly challenged and upset by the student protests of the late 1960s, I think he actually died shortly after a confrontation with students who challenged him on why he wasn't taking political action. It's very significant for him. But Adorno, he was yet adamant about the role of critique and the space for thought itself in the face of the demand for political praxis. Calling thinking a force of resistance, he was quite clear on why we must politically maintain a space for critical thought. And here I quote Adorno. Thinking is not the intellectual reproduction of what already exists anyway. As long as it doesn't break off, thinking has a secure hold on possibility. Its insatiable aspect, its aversion to being quickly and easily satisfied, refuses the foolish wisdom of resignation. End quote. So I want to take this idea of thinking as a form of critique, as a form of resistance, as what Agamben is trying to do in his meditations, we could say, his reflections on the body, as a space beyond how we have inscribed it into a certain political sense of action and activity. He wants to do for the body what Adorno and Žižek want to do for political thought, to pull back, think, and not place any preconceived ideas of praxis or action upon the bodies or the beings that we are. This call to thinking as a force of resistance is perhaps best illustrated through the work of Jacques Derrida, whose hesitancy to engage any direct form of politics was often a source of discouragement to those who were more inclined to political praxis, especially from the side of Marxist theorists. And here I'm thinking of Frederick Jameson, Kenneth Surin, and different radical leftist thinkers. They're always so quick to be dismissive of Derrida because he didn't take a concrete political stance. But of course, Derrida's refusal to do so was for a very deliberate reason. And I think it shares in this with Agamben. Derrida's insistence, in fact, on providing a critique of sovereignty alongside what appeared to be the endless deferral of meaning through the play of différance, captured something of the endless conversation that liberalism represents, at least according to Schmitt. Derrida's refusal of the either-or nature of the decision that produces the sovereign subject, a la Kierkegaard, left him searching for other ways to institute the subject, perhaps through something like a passive decision, as Jeffrey Bennington has recently put it. Such an alignment might also go a long way toward explaining why a good many academics, intent on certain, even scientific forms of decisionism, and here I think a good many philosophical and theological communitarians should be included. This goes to a long way to explain why they protested Derrida's work so vehemently, as it seemed to constantly evade the moment of decision that typically grounds a community's autonomously established sense of sovereignty. If the pluralistic, endless discourses of liberalism are already opposed by definition to the decisionism of those wishing to be sovereign, then Derrida's dalliances in language were almost bound to fail from their inception with the latter crowd. What I mean by this I'll pause for a drink. It's a good moment to silence your phones, huh? What I mean by this is it's no surprise if we take Carl Schmitt's distinction between liberalism and sovereignty seriously. It's no surprise that Derrida was vehemently protested and rejected, mainly by analytical philosophers, but even by other philosophers who felt his work essentially was an endless conversation that never drifted into the realm of political decisionism. He never took a concrete decision toward what the actual identity of the community should be. And I would say for this reason, his work was protested very heavily. And I think Agamben falls into a very similar category. He runs the same risk of being protested or labeled as antinomian because he refuses to enter that space. He always refrains, pulls back, and does not make a decision, but insists rather on contemplation, on deactivating the machine, and not toward actually reinscribing us into a definitive machinery of some alternative variety. Agamben's relationship with Derrida was not always amicable and not always clearly defined either. It seems that at times they mirror each other while also simultaneously disavowing any possible connection between them. What is at least clear is that the only new possible use of the human body is made available from the deactivation of the old body, the one we had thought we possessed. In some sense, this is perhaps akin to Derrida's insistence that the deconstructive act is only possible from within a pre-existing structure or identity, not external to it. So what do we mean by this? I'll give you another example with my son. I hope these entertain you. When my son was very little, when we lived in Belgium, he was probably 4 years old, 3.5, 4 years old. And in 1 week, I had two experiences that really define what I'm trying to get at here. One was at a birthday party for a friend of his. We were at a restaurant. And my son sees an adult go into a restroom. And my son can't tell if that's a man or a woman. So he says, what is that? Is that a man or a woman? And I, being the liberal university professor, very sensitive to bathroom issues like in America, I say, why does it matter? Why do you need to know? Why is it so important that you can categorize and label this individual? I'm thinking in my mind here of Agamben's whatever being. Why can't we let them be whatever? My son is adamant. I need to know. What is it? Is that a man or a woman? It defies his sense of categorization. So what he's pointing to is what appears to be the necessity for the signature that is placed upon the body. I need to understand the way in which that body is represented. Okay. 2 days before that incident, I'm on the playground at my son's school, and my son is referring to a friend of his whose name is Niklash, who's from Tibet. And my son says, Niklash is great. She's one of my good friends. She's fantastic, etc. And I was confused because I knew that Niklash was a boy. So I said, I'm confused. Is Niklash a boy or a girl? Because you say she, but I think Niklash is a boy. But Niklash had his ears pierced, a Tibetan tradition, and he had longer hair. And my son says to me, I don't know, it doesn't matter. Niklash is my friend. Now, what's the difference? My son already knew the difference. He respected Niklash's body for whatever Niklash's body was, in whatever being, because he was able, through a relationship with his body and his being, to let go of the categorizations and the labels. He did not care. But when he was in a sphere of strangers where social representation and language rule, he needed to know. I think what Agamben wants for this new use of the body is something like what my son had in relation to Niklash. He wants to say that that possibility exists. We can get to a space where we don't care. And in the use of bodies, Agamben defines this as a form of intimacy without relation. That's the phrase he uses there. Intimacy without pre-established relations. And he says we can go toward that. We just need to see this. Yeah? I'll come back to this, but I would say this captures the divergence between Agamben and Derrida to some degree. So I'm going to say a little something about this. Derrida insists on there being nothing outside of the text, nothing outside of the representations we have to work with. So Derrida can't contemplate, in a certain sense, he can't contemplate nudity as a real possibility. Whereas Agamben wants to say, there is real nudity, we just have trouble talking about it and seeing it. Okay? Something like that. So we wear clothes, and we know that the real presentation lies underneath the clothes. But we don't know how to talk about that. In fact, that throws us off. If we walk around the campus naked, there will be problems. Yeah? But we know that that nudity is real. It does exist. We just don't know how to put it into symbolic economic form. Unless we turn it into pornography or something. But in an everyday sense, no, we don't know how to do that. It does exist, but we don't know how to deal with it. I think that's sort of the divergence with Derrida and Agamben. For Derrida, there's only the clothes we have to work with. For Agamben, no, there is nudity there. We just don't know how to deal with it. But the theological realm, I think Agamben says, calls us to pay attention to that nudity. The great figure here for me is the body of Christ. Yeah. The body of Christ who's crucified naked. But especially in America, most churches put a cloth over him. Yeah. They put clothes on him. This is a profound moment, an insight. We don't know how to deal with the exposure of the thing itself, whether that's Christ's penis or whether it's just the nudity of the person in their vulnerability and fragility, in the precariousness of their being. It's there, but we don't know how to deal with it. I think Agamben is saying we need to learn how to deal with it. Though Agamben clearly shares with Derrida a certain critique of sovereignty, it's also clear that Agamben's preferred source for discussing the potential for theopolitical transformation is Pauline thought, St. Paul's writings, which offers him the chance to reread philosophical operations through a theological lens. Pauline messianism offers the most direct model for contemplating the deactivation of subjectivity and personal identity that one can imagine, though it has also been historically domesticated by the church on occasion. In Agamben's reading of things, however, Pauline messianism, quote, acts as a corrective to the demonic hypertrophy of angelic and human powers. The Messiah deactivates and renders inoperative the law as well as the angels, and in this way reconciles them with God, end quote. Jesus Christ, an identification between individual and messianic or Christic vocation that is so strong no article is inserted between the two words, becomes for Paul an entrance into the deactivation of all social, political, economic, and religious identities, including the Judaic one that had seemed to identify Jesus from his birth. Quote, the ultimate and glorious telos of the law and of the angelic powers, as well as of the profane powers, is to be deactivated and made inoperative, end quote. Rather than offering a rejection of Judaic law, however, Jesus' attempt to surpass the literal requirements of the law through claiming to be its fulfillment introduced something like a hypernomian moment within the seemingly unbridgeable dualism between nomos and enomi. What is very interesting to note in this formulation of things is, first of all, the very difficulty that arises in locating such a position as a potentially hypernomian one, a reality that is reflected by the awkwardly invented and infrequently utilized term itself, hypernomian, which indicates something we still do not know we still do not know what to do with, or how to think about its potential for deactivating the law. Hypernomian is used by Elliot Wolfson and a number of other thinkers to try to describe this state of neither being nomos nor anomy. It's not antinomian, but we're not sure what to call this. And I think the difficulty of even having a word to describe this state is indicative of how difficult it is to understand it. But essentially, hypernomian is an attempt to explain Jesus' answer, I didn't come to do away with law, but I came to fulfill it. And I think for the most part, we still don't know what that means. What exactly is my relationship then to law and to structure, if I'm to live this fulfillment of law? Establishing such a hypernomian position, which Agamben seeks to access through a number of differing terms, such as pure potentiality, or the division of division itself, for example. They all seem to involve a negative dialectic of sorts that promises to subdivide the division introduced by the pre-existing social division that yet grants the individual a sense of identity, that allows the individual to subsist in the world of language. And I'll return to this in a moment. It's also what introduces the messianic suspension of identity as a threshold of indifference to already existing and often firmly reinforced social, political, and religious dichotomies. Quote, in Paul, the messianic community as such is anonymous and appears to be situated on an undifferentiated threshold between public and private, end quote. This characteristic of anonymity is essential here to understand, because it is this lack of identity that allows it precisely to contest the articulation of sovereign power and its resultant identifications. So, in essence, you're not going to battle against identity with another new, maybe stronger identity. You can only battle it through anonymity, through the loss of identity, as it is specifically marked in our linguistic realm. So how do you battle? You battle, say, the sovereignty or maybe possibly the tyranny or totality of identity forms through anonymity and through vulnerability, through the precariousness of nudity. These are the weapons against those forms. That's why the human body and its fragility becomes a powerful tool and a weapon. I'm thinking here too of Judith Butler's work, if you've followed her work at all. Judith Butler's last few books have really focused on the vulnerability and the precarity of human existence. That's a weapon and a tool in a way, but one that's often trounced even harder, you could say, beat up by the powers that be. As Agamben describes this formulation more recently in a short essay, quote, the form of life is the point in which the work of an opus and the work on oneself perfectly coincide. The painter, the poet, the thinker, and in general anyone who practices an art or an activity are not the appointed sovereign subjects of a creative operation and an opus. They are rather anonymous living beings who, contemplating and making at each turn inoperative the opus of language, of vision, and of bodies, try to experience themselves and keep in relation with a potentiality that is to constitute their life as form of life, with the hyphens. That's from the Fire and the Tail. It's a very recent translation in English, at least, of Agamben. Contemplation, as the medium of inoperativity, becomes the essential path toward one's potentiality and consequently the hope for embodying a form of life lived beyond the sovereign subject and its indebtedness to the realm of representation. Paul, for his part, does not engage in formulating the necessity for a Trinitarian economy to found and legitimate a given cosmological ordering, which consists, as we've already seen, in acts of reciprocal glorification, intended to cement sovereign power. Rather, he engages in the task of messianic redemption, which sees the veil that both conceals and reveals the divine glory erased, therefore allowing glory to be transmitted from God to humanity. It is only in this fashion that Paul can think the deactivation of this reciprocal glory that otherwise seeks to sustain the connection between economy and glory, as between kingdom and government, or sovereignty and liberalism, in Schmidt's phrase. This is a movement parallel, at least at one brief point in Agamben's analysis, to Jesus' possible subversion of the doxological use of the Amen, as he refers to this in the Kingdom and the Glory. A more sustained subversion of glory comes about through multiple rereadings of the Pauline theological tradition, including the realization that glory attempts to cover over the true nature of the human being, what the notion of the Sabbath, or Shabbat, perfectly captures, its inoperativity. God's glory, as is noted in the Kingdom and the Glory, quote, coincides with the cessation of all activity and all works, end quote. The true holy day is the day when all activity has been suspended and whose suspension must be rigorously maintained. Quote, Sabbatism is the name of eschatological glory that is, in essence, inoperativity, end quote. What had concerned the governmental apparatus above all else is the very thing that defines both humanity and the divine being, but which must, for this very reason, be concealed at the same time that it is revealed, the inoperative nature of divine and human existence. Quote, man has dedicated himself to production and labor because in his essence he is completely devoid of work, because he is the sabbatical animal par excellence, end quote. Agamben's task, which becomes clearer through his elucidation of Paul's messianic politics, is to begin to think inoperativity outside of the apparatus of glory that has defined Western political theological relations. This is a task that involves exposing the nudity of God as much as the nudity of the human being, but both beyond the signatures that have been placed upon them or to whose existence one might be reacting. That is, it is a movement of vulnerability, precariousness, and poverty, not a reinscription back into a matrix of either established or newly minted power relations. I think this is why Agamben loves the image of the human being as what he calls a regression, a more infantile form of the primate. Yeah? He says this in Idea of Prose, and then he brings this back in this new book, The Fire and the Tail. He likes this idea of we are basically the infantile form of the primate. We're the vulnerable, hairless creature that needs to be sheltered and protected. We're not an advancement, an evolution as a positive progression. We are a regression of the primate into a more infantile form. This for him is why we are a sabbatical animal par excellence. We have suspended our normal adult growth of the primate so that we are basically a child ape. That's what the human is. And he likes this image, I think, because for him it's more vulnerability, precariousness, and poverty that defines us. It's the suspension of what we should be that makes us a human being. This idea will take Agamben down a brief tour of Pauline thought in general. as it resonates with these thoughts. In The Kingdom and the Glory, and at a much lengthier exposition of this weak messianic force in The Time That Remains, among other places, where St. Paul appears as the apparent solution to the impasse that hypernomianism is attempting to overcome. At its most basic level, what takes place in the messianic suspension of all vocations and identities is a displacement of the subject that actually gives rise to the possibility for life itself to emerge from underneath its inscription in the anthropological machinery. Quote, in the same way that the Messiah has brought about the law and at the same time rendered it inoperative, so the hos me, the as not, maintains and at the same time deactivates in the present all the juridical conditions and all the social behaviors of the members of the messianic community, end quote. Such a messianic politics is possible through its ability to produce a gap between every identity and itself, a permanent caesura that divides any pre-existing social division. Hence, he says, the Jew lives as if not a Jew, and the Gentile as if not a Gentile, producing a new form of universality through the negation of a prior negation that was yet constitutive of one's identity. The Christian, Paul will claim, is the person who does not possess an identity, but only makes use of identities. This is the major investigative claim of the finale of the Homo Sacer Project, in the highest poverty and the use of bodies. This is the act that thereby renders one's relation to the law as not quite a negation of the law, but rather a fulfillment of it, in the sense that one can make use of it without possessing it or being possessed by it. This is its hypernomian flavor. Hence, Agamben's project is not antinomian in the sense of trying to exist apart from law or state or governance, but rather he wants to think the anomy within every law, the anarchy within every power, the unrepresentable within every representation, and the form of life exposed as the inoperativity immanent in every life. It is with this realized form of inoperativity that we find perhaps something like a new form of prayer as a contemplation of potentiality that opens up a space for a new joy to take place within the life that is being lived beyond all given forms of representational life. More specifically, he considers how, quote, the messianic life is the impossibility that life might coincide with a predetermined form, the revoking of every bios in order to open it to the zoe tui iuso. This is the life that is Jesus. And the inoperativity that takes place here is not merely inertia or rest. On the contrary, it is the messianic operation par excellence, end quote. As such, there is the possibility of accessing life itself, life, the Zoe, through Jesus, identified as Jesus, Jesus as life, beyond the social forms of life, the bios, that have been inscribed upon us, the theological signatures we bear. This is not bare life, which is the result of the sacrificial machinery that violently reduces human beings to a form of life without hyphens, lived outside the polis. It is rather a form of life with the hyphens that can only be accessed by rendering inoperative the identities that have been foisted upon humanity from the exclusionary acts that define social relations and which Agamben wants to escape through taking up a type of intimacy without relation, or a bond without the prescribed social representations being placed upon it. In essence, this is what is sought after in the only authentic way to represent something, by demonstrating only our failure to represent the thing itself. This is the only possible way to achieve a presentation beyond representation, not through the mythical suggestion of an almost magical entity or encounter, but rather by showing or exposing the failure itself as the only true representation. I mentioned this yesterday. It is in this place of experience of failure that is paradoxically our only hope of success that we encounter glory once again. And I find this very interesting, and this is what I'll conclude with. Another form of glory, this time in a radically different sense. What Agamben will later describe as a means of entirely immanent grace, beyond the falsely sacralized forms of grace that the church has too often peddled. The form of life, with hyphens, lived beyond its inscription in any representational matrix. This is the eternal life that Paul promises through the messianic suspension of all existing identities. It is a life that predates our inscription into the anthropological machinery, that religion, as a fabricator all too often of the false sacred, has fostered. There is in such gestures a sort of kenotic nihilism, perhaps, reconceived as a form of negative dialectics, that undoes the divide between sovereignty and governmentality, and that thereby introduces to us our own poverty as forms of life, with hyphens. But it is also that which must be recognized as the only way to move beyond the impasse that such political representational dualisms present us with. So I'll stop there with this notion of a grace or a glory possible beyond the glory and grace we traditionally conceive of in theological terms. Agamben hints at it and even uses those exact words, grace and glory, but in a very different meaning than the ones he genealogically deconstructs. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent paper. Now we have 15-20 minutes at the most in which we can you can ask questions. Please try to be brief as much as possible so that we are able to carry out the good dialogue in the time remaining. Thank you very much, Professor Dickinson, for your excellent paper, which is elucidative and provocative in the sense of leading us to reflection. My name is Joel. I am a student of the graduate studies program in philosophy of Unisinos. Studying with Professor Castor, I was studying the book, The Kingdom and the Glory, and an issue or a question that I extracted, that Agamben brought to my reflection, is the one that I'm going to try to express, in the sense that Agamben constructs a genealogy in which he traces various elements that come from the Roman Catholic tradition. And this appears also in other texts by him, such as Highest Poverty, Opus Dei, and The Kingdom and the Glory itself. So, actually, as Professor Rodrigo also mentioned, he works with paradigms. And this, fundamentally, refers to the notion of the paradigm of economic theology. But what I realized in this genealogy was the fact that Agamben does not dwell on issues referring to the theology of the Reformation, for instance. He uses or works with very little or very few references from the Reformation. One of them you mentioned, which is Calbart. So I conclude my question, which is a comment at the same time, by asking, doesn't Agamben run the risk of making a genealogy, which is in a way a confessional one, a denominational one? Why shouldn't we recall that the West, the liberal West, which is centered on the category of work, extracted that from Protestantism? So how can we think of this aporia? So this is just a hint, an insight of mine. Thank you. We have a further question over here.
Well, thank you for your lecture. It's very interesting. I have 2 points to play. The first one is I was remembering an American theologist, Catherine Keller. We were spoken about her yesterday, and she shows some genealogy of gender in the text of Apocalypse, no? And it's very interesting what she said, because she said the scriptures only put women, no, or just a virgin, or just a prostitute, no, in a duality, not a trinity, but a duality. No, it's interesting. The signature, the theological signature in the female body, no. And I was thinking in the difference between Agamben and Derrida, because yes, I agree with you. The problem of nudity, no, not the bare life, but nudity, because Derrida, in the eyes of Agamben, still be a catechontic thinker, no, just
Yes.
Schmidt.
Yes.
It's because the difference and so the nudity, it's what makes Agamben possibly an ontology of potentiality and nudity, and maybe the disarm or disactivation of this duality between the virgin and the prostitute. I don't know.
Okay, so I'll respond to both questions. Let me start with the nudity one first. I do think, and I thought this even before the book Nudities came out, that nudity really is a central example for him of what he's trying to do with his work. And I think you're exactly right. Derrida functions as a catechon. He slows down the revelation. And the real revelation we should be after is this exposure, this nudity. But it's not a nudity that's reinscribable back into, let's say, a sexualized matrix. No, it's one devoid of that. And that's why when he mentions the body in this way, his comments on Auschwitz become very significant. He mentions, even in his essay on nudities, he says it's the bodies of the people in the lagers, the people in the camps. These are the bodies we're talking about that take on a different significance. There's something about the vulnerability of the body in those moments that speaks to us differently. And that's what we need to try to touch in some way, that limit. I always think of, in this way, in America, which is a very puritanical country, you're not allowed to show nudity on TV, right? No naked bodies on TV. So we had that moment at the Super Bowl years ago where Janet Jackson had a part of her breast revealed, and there was a huge outcry. This is awful and terrible. But it was earlier, before that incident, that we actually had a movie was shown on TV during times when children could watch, with full frontal nudity of both men and women. The only time ever done on American television. But it was Schindler's List, the Spielberg film about the camps. And then it was okay to show full nudity because something had changed in the symbolic grid. So I think you're exactly right. We don't know how to theorize nudity. We don't know how to confront nudity. And that has become a prime example for Agamben in a way that Derrida could not address. Though he tries in a way with his writing. He has a book on animality where he talks about his shame in front of his cat that looks at him. I think Agamben does not have shame in front of his pets, but there's something else going on. But that's an excellent point. To your question, thank you very much for that. I think you're touching on a very significant issue in Agamben's work, which is to what degree is he repeating the act of the Reformation endlessly? And I think the answer is, well, he is. He's taking up what Paul Tillich called the Protestant principle. It's this drive for ever more reform that seems to be generated from the heart of Christianity itself, and that is never satisfied and never settled. I think what Agamben wants to do is to say it's not just a Protestant principle, it's the original relation of Christianity to Judaism. It's the original relation to any structure, any institution. Now, because he looks at it as a bigger picture, he's not going to do as creative a work with the Reformation in particular. He's more interested in Protestant theologians who try to then reinscribe this radical impulse for reform back within a matrix of sovereignty. So Karl Barth again. But he misses out on, let's say, the other side of theology and of Protestant theology that really does try to think the nature of reform and as perhaps a permanent possibility. But then again, he's Italian, so he's got a Catholic background, and he's not as interested in, I think, looking at that side of theology. Now, what's interesting to me in this regard is the work of John Caputo. I don't know if you read him here, but John Caputo's work, which is very much modeled after Derrida, he is trying to think a permanent reformation from within the church. But it's funny how that plays out realistically for Caputo. And by the way, Caputo, I've asked him about this, and we both agree that Derrida and Agamben are very similar in this regard. Caputo sees that too. But Caputo wants to talk about a permanent deconstruction of every institutional identity. But Caputo was raised Catholic. And whenever he has a conference where he talks about this radical theology that's always destabilizing the institution of the church, everyone in the crowd is a Protestant pastor. And no Catholics come. And he's always very disappointed because he's trying to speak to Catholics, but he only attracts the Protestants who are all trying to hold a church in the kitchen of their home, you know. They want to be so not institutional. They have no church building. They're in their homes. But then they're always recreating a structure in an institution, and they're disappointed. So it's a strange, paradoxical situation. But I think your question is a wonderful one, because that impetus for reform is very much what he's trying to isolate, and it does recreate some issues. And this is why Luther had to have his antinomian defense. Yeah? Luther was mistaken as being antinomian by his own followers, who then wanted to be antinomian. And Luther had to come back and say, no, I'm not antinomian. It's just an impulse for reform. It's the same charge levied against Agamben. Yeah? He's antinomian. No, I'm not. I'm just trying to reform. It's the same issue, yes, in some ways.
Muito bem.
Further questions? If you have no further questions, now, still in relation to this topic, we might phrase it perhaps in the following manner. When we see in Genesis that human being or humankind was created in the image and likeness of God, certainly it would not be wise to go down in interpretation to the biological couple of the male and the female that carries us. I think that this issue of the body has gotten too much relevance in this debate. We should go up a little higher. And when we read in the first chapter of John that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God. It was in the beginning with God. And all things were created through the Word. There we see the first cause in action, and we as second causes should do our part in this work according to the image and likeness. This is where between the rapture of the Trinity towards the binity, I would prefer to say duality. I think that following here a little the Hebrew tradition, what we have today in the world is the kingdom and the power. The glory is outside of the picture, is out there. So today what we see manifest in the world is precisely the human power in action, building a kingdom which is not that kingdom, that other kingdom. So the operativity, and here comes the issue of the Reformation, whether the world is not Protestant, the operativity is part of the human nature because it is present in the prime cause, which is always creative, and we are creative too. So to create, to work is our job, our task. So the issue would be to direct that work and to reconnect it to the Trinity. So I'd like to know what is your view about this discussion, whether we shouldn't or put the discussion back, Agamben's discussion back, not so much into the inoperativity, but rather in the way of operating. So in order to really intervene in the process of the world and put back in it the principles of the Trinity. Thank you. We have a final question here by Professor Castor Bartolomé de Ruiz. So, Professor Dickinson, first of all, thank you very much for the two conferences, for your availability to come here to be with us and share with us your research, which really, your contribution is also very relevant. We are going to work on it for a long time, certainly. Now, allow me one final provocation. The body in Agamben has the importance that you highlighted. And Agamben wants to take from it the signature of sacrality so that a form of naturality of the body may appear. First of all, Christianity is the only religion, as far as I know, that advocates defends the resurrection of the bodies, which inserts the body as a constituent or as being constitutive of the individual and inseparable. The view of soteriology of salvation includes the body. This is where that question surfaces that Professor Alain Gignac also mentioned. Would it be interesting to think about this dimension of Christianity, since it is the only religion that proposes the resurrection of the body? And in this resurrection of the bodies, wouldn't that be an interesting signature in order to think of a political dimension of the body in a really from a different perspective? This is not actually a provocation that I'm directing to Agamben.
Thank you for that. Let me start first with the first question about whether we should rather think the image of God a bit higher up, as you put it, or more elevated, I guess, in relation to John and the Word being a better way, perhaps, to think through the image of God. I think, though, when you start talking about how creating is our task of humanity, I mean, Agamben explicitly says the opposite, that inoperativity is the unique task of humanity. I think the fear is that such a position reinscribes itself back into a logic of sovereignty, but at a different level, in a different way. For example, one of the issues Agamben does not really take up, but I hear a little bit in the way you were describing this other image, it would strike me as more Eastern Orthodox. I mean, I think the position you're advocating would be something like an Orthodox position, that we should model ourselves on a notion of Trinity, and the Spirit is very central, and yet there is a way to reinscribe that back into it, let's say a sovereign ecclesiology or a certain notion of the subject. I don't think Agamben deals with this explicitly, at least not in the way he could, but I do think something like that perhaps takes place, let's say, in more Orthodox theologies, which are very hierarchical, which are very, I think in the West, we sometimes think of them as very, I would say, old school, very, very traditional in a certain sense. But they're very different in the way they construct subjectivity. I think the image of God becomes, yes, not rooted in the body in a certain sense, but rooted in a notion of God that transcends even bodily being, which appears to be good, but can also be a way to reinscribe sovereignty at a whole different level. I'm no longer wedded to any, traditional institutional form that seems oppressive, but now I've reinscribed the oppression at a much deeper level of individuality. This would go back to my comment on the Reformation. We could say there are certain Protestant groups that have really learned how to challenge institutional structure in such a way as to alleviate oppression. But we could also say there's a Protestant temptation to reinscribe oppression and domination at the level of every individual. And it becomes even more oppressive, or at least it could be tempted to. And it's a tricky domain. So I don't know if I'm giving a good answer, because I think what you're suggesting could lead somewhere, and that somewhere could be more liberating perhaps, but it could also lead somewhere perhaps more oppressive. And I think we'd have to talk that through a lot more, because the idea of, operativity is part of human nature, that's a certain theological reading. And I think that already enters into a certain domain that Agamben's very hesitant to do. And he says the human is actually the perfect creature of Sabbat. We're actually a creature of inoperativity by nature. But of course, that runs very fundamentally, in contradiction with a certain reading of Genesis and the fall. That's very different. Okay, but Castor, to your response, I think the idea of thinking resurrection, the resurrected body, is fascinating, and would be very interesting to think alongside Agamben's comments on the body, and especially the glorious body, which is his attempt to talk about the resurrected body in some sense. I think I would need to do it, though, alongside theologies today that also look at the resurrected body, but from a slightly different perspective. And what I mean is, the way Agamben talks about and critiques the glorious body is very much in line with his critique of how that's a manifestation of reinscribing us back in a sovereign form. But what I'm more curious about would be the resonance between Agamben's work and theologies of disability. Because there are certain theologies of disability, of handicapped persons, that talk about the issue of the resurrected body as very central, but in a very different way. Because they want to say the resurrected body is not a perfect body. It's a body that still has its disability that you had here in this world. And that's the body that is central to our embodied nature and to our theological sense of the goodness of the body, etc. But that's a very different reading than the glorious body as a perfect body, where the body that was deformed or handicapped in some way now becomes perfected. I think what Agamben would be more helpful in helping us to think are those bodies that are poor, bodies that are inherently impoverished through disability. And I think he would say, yes, the body is important, but it's a vulnerable, precarious, and poor body. That's the body we should be attentive to, not some sort of perfected, glorious body in that sense. So I think he would still perhaps be useful for thinking through the possibility of a resurrected body, but I think it has to be nuanced in that it needs to be a handicapped body in some sense. It's a body that is precarious and vulnerable, a body that is impoverished. And that's a very powerful way to think it through too. So I agree with Alain Badiou that Agamben is a Franciscan ontologist. He's always thinking about poverty. And I think that that should be a central way we understand even our relationship to our bodies and even possibly resurrected bodies. That we can think that, but it has to be a body that's still poor in some sense, not a body that's perfected. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you for your being present among us, for your important contribution to our colloquium. I thank all and each one of you who also participated in our event. Thank you for your questions and comments. You can carry on this debate on the basis of the coverage of our event, and it is being already made available for us on the site of our institute. We also hope that soon we will be able to publish the texts, the papers, which are going to be reviewed and later published to our series of booklets on public theology that will be available on in PDF files on our site. Thank you once again. Have a good lunch.